Okay, so I'm here with Eric Beckwith. He's with the Redmond City Police Department. Eric, why don't you give us give us your title, a little bit of background, to whatever degree you're willing to share.
Sure. My name is, like you said, Eric Beckwith. I'm a patrol lieutenant for the City of Redmond Police Department. Been employed with the Redmond Police Department since April of 2007. While employed here at the Redmond Police Department, I've been a lieutenant, obviously, a sergeant, detective sergeant, criminal detective, street crimes detective. Was also assigned to our region's SWAT team as an operator, a breacher, and I'm currently attached to our command post as an assistant team commander. Just prior to being a police officer, I was a community justice officer with Deschutes County Juvenile Corrections for about 5 years. I graduated from the University of Idaho in 2001 with a Bachelor of Science in Health Science and Marketing. Married, 3 kids, proud sisters resident. Let's see what else. I think how's that? Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Give me your title, your level, real quick, one more time for our students.
I'm the patrol lieutenant.
So you're a lieutenant with the Redmond PD.
That's correct.
Good. Okay. What? Had a question for you. One of the things that you do is you go around this country and you train other police officers in other departments, which was interesting to me when I heard that. What kind of training do you educate them? You train them in what way?
Most of it's in force response. We teach here at the Redmond Police Department a model that's based on some curriculum that was developed by a guy named George Williams, who's a pretty famous guy out of the state of California. Did some police training years back, and we teach them about force response. We teach them, the fundamentals of case law, specifically three Supreme Court cases. Obviously, Graham is the driving one, Connor, and Garner. Those are the three cases we start those classes on, and then we teach techniques that put officers in positions to overcome resistance and aggression within those parameters of those cases and those laws, right? So a lot of it's principle-based teaching rather than skill-based teaching. We don't teach jujitsu or anything like that. We just teach them to try to resolve those things within the police solution.
Okay, great. And let's say as a police officer, and just generically, a police officer, what's the greatest challenge today that a police officer faces, and how has that changed over the last, say, 20 years? You've been at it for 13. Let's just stick with 13 then.
Yeah, Ken, that's a really good question. In fact, I was watching some of the police officers that work for us in Redmond in action today. And I think things have changed dramatically just in the past maybe 3 to 5 years. Whereas not only are new officers worried about their own personal safety and the safety of the community, but also have this additional fear of how their actions are going to be perceived by people and how the public's going to kind of critique their actions. And I could see it in officers, and it kind of slows them down. I think it makes them second guess decisions sometimes. And I think it adds a layer of stress that I haven't seen before. And then as the patrol commander, that's also become an issue for me, is how are we going to manage the message, especially if somebody gets a hold of a piece of a police problem and tries to spin that however they want to spin it. And so I think things have changed in that regard. I think the other things that have changed have been interesting to me are in things for instance, drug enforcement. I think drug enforcement is moving more towards a public health issue than a law enforcement issue. And law enforcement officers are now being asked to respond more to mental health crises and people in mental health crisis, kind of in lieu of that. So that's a much different perspective. I would say those are the two main things that I see.
That's interesting. Okay, great. Do you trying to think of her name? It'll come to me. But anyway, Heather McDonald talks about the Ferguson effect. So coming out of, I think it was 2012, coming out of Ferguson when all the protests, and then and that was kind of this first um, uh, perspective of cops and cops kind of backing up, and then crime spiked up, and now with the thing in Minneapolis, now they're supposedly, if from the criminology perspective, they're calling it the Minneapolis effect, right? So and we've seen probably in the last few months, we've seen crime start to spike up. And that might be because of other reasons like COVID. But is that, do you think, a legitimate theory based just on your experience that once these kind of heated things happen, that officers, I mean, if I was an officer, I'd be like, I don't know if I want to get involved. But kind of,
Yeah.
it better be pretty serious for me to get involved. I might have gotten involved a year ago, but now, is that legitimate?
I do believe it is legitimate. I think one of the things that people need to understand is just the biology of a human being, let alone a human police officer. And when officers see things happening, even in other areas of the state, they assume, oh, well, people everywhere don't appreciate the fact that I'm willing to risk my life to save their own. It really has a direct impact on their proactive policing. So, not necessarily reactive policing. Police officers will generally always respond to calls. I think the only exception we've seen in that is in Baltimore, right? And there was a time where Baltimore police officers weren't even responding to 911 calls after what we would call the Ferguson effect. But it's legitimate. And I think that's one of the struggles we have nationwide. Like roughly 9 million employees of police departments, and everyone reacts differently. Um, but it's real. I've seen it firsthand in the areas that we work. We might have a protest that happens in the Central Oregon area that gets out of hand, for instance, and then I see guys, maybe not so proactive, and they start talking about, well, why would I go out there and do this if this is the way I'm going to be treated? So that is real, and it's guys like me. It's my responsibility to combat that, right, and talk to guys about why we do things and what the mission is, things like that.
It would seem like it hurts the law-abiding citizens the most, that need the protection the most, that are the most vulnerable amongst us. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's accurate. I think the people that usually cause those problems are the least qualified individuals to be causing the most problems, right? Some of them might have had a poor interaction with a police officer, and yeah, they might have some legitimate reasons to be upset, and that's going to happen. I mean, we don't do it right all the time. I'll tell you that for sure. But it does create risk factors for those that aren't involved in those events and aren't causing this divide between certain community areas and their police departments. And I think that's the biggest issue, right? Once you start to drive a wedge between the community and the police department, man, that's not good, right? We need to have a connection with our community, so we can know how to serve them best. So yeah, I think that Ferguson effect is real. I've seen articles, I've read articles, I've talked to police officers in other areas, that, when those things kind of flash, they're just kind of anchored in, right? We'll do maybe some things, but the other stuff, they don't want any part of it.
Okay, I'm going to throw a couple of like cliche jargon kind of public stuff, like stop and frisk or stop, ask, and frisk.
Mhm.
Can you respond to that? Stop and frisk. I mean, you're in the communities, you hear stuff, but give us, speak into that stop and frisk.
Well, I think that brings up an issue about how, when we talk about getting better as law enforcement officers, I think those are areas that we can get better at, right? So maybe in New York, they institute a stop and frisk, where in the Northwest, we would not engage in a policy like that because it violates, the Terry versus Ohio Supreme Court decision, right, about reasonable suspicion. And then it creates opportunities for people to question the actions of the police department, and you can't really respond to that, right? Um, I think the hard part about the two divided sides on stop and frisk and how that happened in New York is that it was incredibly successful, right? Like, tremendous amount of guns off the streets, violent crime rates dropped tremendously. But people looking from the outside in saw that as a violation of people's constitutional rights. And in some cases, I believe that did happen. But excuse me. So, stop and frisk has been interesting to me. And, we here in the Northwest operate in the Ninth Circuit, and there's been some decisions even this year that are real difficult for us to have proactive police officers. For example, you can basically no longer talk to a passenger of a motor vehicle. You can't ask him questions really unless you have reasonable suspicion to do so, right? And so those are some of the things that prevent us from doing proactive police work, right? But
And
yeah,
what's proactive police work? Tell us what that is.
proactive police work is what we would prefer our officers to be doing the majority of the time if we could do it, right? So if an officer has discretionary time, we would like them to be in their uniform, in their police car, in neighborhoods, in areas of high crime, trying to prevent crime and to respond to crime before somebody becomes a victim of a crime. That's our ideal police model. Reactive policing is officers in their car being dispatched to 911 calls for service, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's where you have the biggest impact on your community is when you have a discretionary time for officers to be proactive. And I think that's where it leads into some of these communities where they feel like they've been targeted by police officers is, cops will go to certain areas that are high crime and spend the majority of their time there and not other places. But it's kind of I call it the squeezing of a balloon effect, right? If you were to take a water balloon and squeeze it, it bubbles on one side or the other. That's kind of how I see crime being addressed especially in our community here. Like I talk to guys all the time that I know in Deschutes County, and they'll be like, "Oh man, hey, we got a bunch of these guys from Redmond that are now here." And it's because, the boots on the ground here in Redmond have been putting enough pressure on them to not commit crimes. They go to other places. And so that's what we would prefer officers to do in regards to proactive policing.
And what about profiling? Profiling people, profiling cars, profiling neighborhoods. Can you respond to that?
So that's a really good question as well. So we here in the Redmond Police Department, there's a couple other agencies amongst Oregon. We record stop data. So every traffic stop we do or every probable cause stop we do, we record everyone's age, race, and gender. And that's recorded in a database, which, just to be just straight with people, the officers here that I work with, it's always, nine times out of 10, Caucasian male, Caucasian female. It's very not usual for us to have contact, especially proactively with somebody that's not Caucasian or white. So they see that as a waste of time, right? They see it as a time, suck that's not useful to them. But I see the greater picture in that. And so you can identify if that's happening in other areas, right? So because I do believe that happens. Now, profiling and reasonable suspicion are interesting to me. I gave this example just the other day. Like we have a problem here in Central Oregon of a large criminal element that's taken up some kind of camps on BLM, right? So they don't have a residence, but they kind of live out in the dirt. They have campers there, and their whole purpose is to stay out there and commit crimes. Well, when our officers see cars driving through Redmond that are covered in BLM dust and maybe occupied by five or six
BLM dust meaning Bureau of Land Management, not Black Lives Matter dust.
Bureau of Land Management, the BLM Bureau of Land Management property that's managed right around Central Oregon. Those guys are interested in those cars, right? And they're doing stops on those cars on valid violations, but they're looking into criminal behavior inside that traffic.
Can you pull a car over for being dirty or dusty?
You're not. You have to have a violation, or you have to have probable cause that a crime's been committed or a violation's been committed. So,
like maybe a taillight out or a sticker on a. So you see that now. Some people might say, "Well, you're profiling that car."
Yeah, and my response to that maybe not.
And they're looking for an excuse to pull it over.
Yeah, and people might not be super excited about my response, but I would say yes. I mean, absolutely, and I'm asking my police officers to do that, right? Like find ways within our parameters of the law to locate people who are consistent, criminals, so the guys that are violating our community on a regular basis, and some of our guys just put a great case together the other day about a bunch of guy that was living out on BLM, Bureau of Land Management property, who was regularly breaking into cars, 3, 5, 10 cars a night, multiple stolen guns, things like that. Those guys made a great case out of that. And, if you ask the officer that made that case, he saw the car, he saw it was covered in dust. He knew it was probably likely out in BLM area. It's in a neighborhood it doesn't belong in. And he pulled it over for a registration violation and 2 other violations that were, I think it was unsafe lane change and some other violation. But long story short, he recovers a tremendous amount of stolen property. The suspect gets taken to jail. But yeah, it's the dust on the car that drew his attention to the car. And then he, operates within his parameters there. So, I think the thing that's not desirable is in other areas you do, and I know it's not going to sound great, you do have officers that are out there that have conflicted internal beliefs. And I think that sometimes they, treat people poorly, right? And they will only stop people of a certain race or color. And, that's not okay.
How prevalent is that out there of like racist policing? I mean, I don't know what other way, how else to say it, but
yeah, I think the good in me and the officer in me wants to say that it's never going to happen or super rare, right? But I think that there's some of that stuff that does creep into law enforcement. I mean, you got to understand when we have officers take things, like a pre-employment screening test, a background check, a psychological evaluation. In some states, they're required to take a polygraph test that talks to them about how they treat other people. But ultimately, all you got to do is lie, right? And if people are good at lying and know how to do it, they're able to infiltrate the ranks of police departments and bring along with them, their bad moral character. And we've seen that, throughout all of time, and cops end up in jail and a lot of them should be in jail. I think we've got some local examples of that, I was very happy to, not happy to, but, anytime we can hold somebody accountable in our own ranks, we're glad to do that because, we don't want those people on our team and we don't want those people associated with our profession.
yeah, it sure gives you all a black eye, right? I mean, whether it's football, because I used to play football, and it's, you always hated to see somebody end up on the front page for a negative story. And it's, I can't speak for police, but in football, it's 1% that get 99% of the publicity. And I would guess it's the same way in police work as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that I've seen recently is you see a lot of, especially here at the Redmond Police Department, we see a lot of our good work being celebrated by people dropping off thank you cards or, calling and saying thank you or sending in officer commendations. And then, but you don't see that in a media standpoint very much, right? You don't see a lot of celebration of good police work in media, but you do see 100% documentation and journalism of bad police behavior. And I'm not saying that's not necessarily incorrect, but I do believe it has this effect on people where they may have never had any interaction with a police officer ever in their life, but based on what they've seen and read, they have this opinion that, majority of police officers are bad. And, that might be very small, but that small group's pretty loud sometimes. And, it influences other people. And I think that's what we're dealing with these days is people, police officers that make bad decisions and bad choices. And, I've got a lot of beliefs on how we could get rid of those people a lot quicker if we didn't have to deal with, police
Yeah.
things.
What about unconscious bias?
Ooh, unconscious bias, right?
It's a big buzzword these days. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I don't really understand that, right? Because, I did a presentation in a high school class about bias last year. And I asked all of the students in that class what they thought about me, right? Standing in their classroom, right? And I asked them to raise their hands if they thought I was a conservative Republican or if I was a liberal Democrat. 99% of them thought I was a conservative Republican, right? And I never share my personal beliefs anytime. And then, and then I ask them other questions about me. So then I ask them if they were biased towards me based on just looking at me. And I was hoping to get some thought processes in there, because I think bias can be inherent to some degree based on your upbringing, your community, your environment, your culture, some things like that. I think the problem, and I think that's almost natural in my opinion, for people to be biased in some regards. But it's when that bleeds into how you treat people where it becomes an issue. And if your bias is bleeding into your way you treat people and you're a police officer, that's a recipe for disaster. And that's that. We got to get rid of that, right? We got to get rid of that.
Okay. What would you want college students to know? Because most college students, and most people for that matter, our most interaction with police officers are either when we need you because we've been either something stolen from us or we've been assaulted, or but then you throw in traffic violations, and so that ups our negative interaction with police officers. So it's easy, like you had just talked about with that class that you visited. It's easy to have our own negative biases or inherent biases towards police officers. What would you want the public, or more specifically college students, to know that you think they don't know, or you would like them to know about?
Well, that's what a great opportunity, right, for me to talk to some young people. I have a son that's attending college now, and we talk about this all the time. And I would like young people specifically to know in college that it's still a great profession, and we still have tremendous people doing great work. My personal fear about the current climate is that we're going to have a lack of ability to recruit highly educated, outstanding people into our profession, because they just don't want to deal with it, right? Hold on a second. Sorry about that. So let me just regather my thoughts. If you're a young person and you've chosen to educate yourself, those are things we desire in police officers, right? If you're trying to get an education and pursue those things, those are the kind of people we need in our profession, right? In my world, the days are gone where guys would go from being a mill worker to a police officer. And I'm not saying that's bad, right? But I believe that the higher level of education we have in an officer, the less likely they are to treat people poorly or make a poor decision while wearing the uniform. So don't give up on us. That's what I would say to young people. I would also say to them, know what you need to know before you're going to say what you're going to say. So I've covered a lot of the protests recently, and I see a lot of young people, especially here in Central Oregon and the Northwest, really, really angry. And I'm a very curious person, so I've been asking a lot about them, what they're angry about. And I'm not getting a lot of great answers specifically, right? And so I think that's important because, people like me in my mid 40s and people I associate with are starting to see young people as these kind of reactionary people that are out there doing whatever because they really don't have a cause or a purpose. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for police to get better, for communities to get better, for people to have a greater understanding of the law and the Constitution and the Supreme Court. And it's not up to me anymore, right? I can go out and do a good job every day. It's going to be up to the next generation of police officers to manage that. And this can be an extremely rewarding job. It can also be extremely difficult. But we need our best coming up in the ranks, because I think because of what's happened on all fronts, being a police officer in the next 10 years is going to be incredibly difficult. So we need some of the best, right? And I don't know what else to say about that. I mean, I think that's know your stuff, man. Do some research. Find more than one source of information before you make an opinion on something. Know that police departments don't release full investigations to the media because they're ongoing investigations. So what you get from the media is likely from an eyewitness account, a cell phone video, or something similar. And it's really not a good practice to make a opinionated decision on something that's happened if you don't have all the information. If you're getting ready to go light a mattress on fire and throw it at a police officer, know why you're doing that. And if you, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling there, but that's what I would have to say.
Good. Well, Eric, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and just being transparent and open and sharing with us from a perspective that none of us, could imagine. But thanks for sharing that with us. I appreciate it.
Anytime, bud.
All right, man.